Good morning. Got Peter Deswood here. Going to read from this book, Hosteen, Klah, again. Sorry, I'm also a high school principal and I do taxes for people, so I've been really busy for the last couple months. So chapter 4 is called The Death of Narbona. Between 1846 and 1849, the Bear Springs Treaty had been broken continuously by both the Navajos and the Apaches. 5 more military expeditions of United States soldiers had been sent against the Navajos, and 2 more treaties had been signed, both of which proved to be useless scraps of paper. These troops carried out scorched earth policy wherever they crossed Navajo territory, killing livestock, trampling fields, and burning hogans. Although they seldom came into contact with the Navajo people, they succeeded by wrecking their economy wherever they marched. The Navajo families in thickly settled areas began to scatter to find homes beyond the periphery of the military invasions. Some went to El Herfino Peaks, which serve as a protective barrier. Others went into Colorado as far as Mesa Verde to live in the La Plata Mountains. The canyons of Arizona as far west as the Grand Canyon were now occupied by various Navajo clans who brought their livestock with them for the purpose of establishing permanent homes where there was safety and freedom. The Canyon de Chelly, with its many branching canyons and its unfailing flow of water, sheltered more than 500 families, and so the Navajo tribe, with widely separated communities, extended its territory to the north and to the west, more than doubling its former extent. Narbona, his family, and his followers did not flee to new territory, but continued to live on the eastern slopes of the Tunija, the Tohatchee, and the Carrizo Mountains. However, their homes were no longer built in open glades or near wide fields. Higher in the mountains, there were rocky ridges where they felt secure, and all homes on the lower slopes were hidden in the canyons or so surrounded by brush as to resemble part of the landscape. This became an established practice, and even many years later, strangers could cross the reservation and not discover a single Navajo dwelling. Horses were pastured in mountain swales, while sheep and goats climbed the higher slopes, so the Navajos managed to live, but it was not the carefree existence of former years. Narbona called many council meetings and advised his headmen and his followers to send word to the governor in Santa Fe that all the Navajos on his side of the mountains desired peace and would agree to whatever terms were offered to establish friendship. He suggested sending a delegation to deliver this message, but his followers voiced many objections. First, they were certain that any small group trying to cross Pueblo territory would be caught and massacred on the way. And second, the governor was sure to put them in prison where they would be held for weeks or months until he could obtain verification of their message. The third reason was the most important and really insurmountable. The governor had demanded the return of all slaves and livestock the Navajos had stolen from either the Mexicans or the Puebloans before the treaty of friendship with the Navajos could be made. Seizing this golden opportunity for revenge, the latter had piled the governor's desk with lists of missing sheep, goats, cattle, and horses, in which were included all that had been stolen by the Apaches, the Comanches, and the Utes. Narbona well knew that the surrender of this amount of livestock would leave the Navajos stripped to the point of starvation, and to this he would not agree. He was now 83 years old, and although his older followers regarded him as the wisest of all leaders, many of the younger warriors refused to listen to his counsel. One of these was his son-in-law Manuelito, who was gaining control of a rebellious band of warrior young braves who held their own council meetings and planned their own raids into enemy territory. Thus, the Eastern Navajos became divided in their allegiance, some approving the tactics of the rebellious young men and others fearful of the results. At this time, there was a blind prophet living on the west side of the mountain. Since he had been blind from birth, his name was Benaatin, and he was said to see with his mind. As the years passed, his dreams, or perhaps just his thoughts, came to be considered prophecies. of coming events, but not in came to the eastern side of the mountains to attend a war chant known as squaw dances, and came into contact with some of the young braves. He told these young warriors that they were doing wrong in not heeding the counsel of the older chiefs, that they were young and foolish and could think no farther than present day. He said, the day will come when your enemies will drive you out of your homeland and you will go to the barren country where the corn will not grow and your sheep will eat poison weeds and die. Many of your people will starve and others will be killed, so that only a few will survive. And in all these wide cornfields, there will be nothing alive except the coyotes and the crows. Many were inclined to believe this prediction, but its fulfillment seemed a long time in the future. And right now, there were enemies to be dealt with. For 18 more years, the Navajos made war on the surrounding tribes, and everyone made war on the Navajos. In August of 1849, Lieutenant Colonel John Washington, military commander of the territory of New Mexico, led an expedition against the Navajos. Besides the officers and staff, there was a cavalry troop of 175 members and a group of 250 New Mexicans, all well mounted and armed. This army of invasion was guided by Ciboleta, Navajo named Sandoval, and by a couple of Jemez Indians. Army mules pulling 2 cannon and many wagons of supplies brought up the rear. Crossing the Jemez Mountains, this cavalcade followed the Rio Chaco, which supplied them with water. They paused 2 days in Chaco Canyon to explore the prehistoric ruins, and Lieutenant Sampson wrote good descriptions of Pueblo Bonito and Chitroquetl. There's a map in here of all of the country, Navajo country, in 1846 to 1868. So if you can see that, take a look at that. You can pause it if you have to. The Navajos of the Eastern Division were dismayed at the size of this army and the speed at which they were approaching. Families were then living in their fields and the crops had not been harvested. Narbona collected 15 horse, 10 mules, and about 50 sheep delivered to the soldiers, with the request that the commander avoid the Nahashiti cornfields where the Hogans were located. Colonel Washington replied that he could not do so, as his horses and mules must feed on the cornfields. So the Navajo families gathered all the food they could carry, packed their possessions on their horses, and fled to the mountains. The troops left the Rio Chaco at the Big Bend and marched to the Tenicha Valley, destroying all the cornfields along their way. And always aware of the hidden Navajos were keeping watch on their progress. Narbona had received reports from the army scouts informing him of the purpose and the destination of the troops. When he heard that the council meeting would be held on the western side of the mountains at the mouth of Canyon de Chelly, he decided he could not attend in person. He conferred with Chief Jose Largo, who was also quite old and infirm, and they decided to ask for a meeting with Colonel Washington, suggesting the names of 2 younger Navajo leaders to act as their proxies. Wishing to appear before the white commander in the dignified role of a great Navajo chief, Narbona called together a majority of Navajo men in his section, who may have numbered about 800 warriors. A smaller group was sent on ahead, driving 1,000 sheep and a few head of cattle, in obedience to the demand of all the stolen livestock must be returned. 3 of the younger chiefs asked to be given an interview with Colonel Washington and Mr. James Calhoun, Superintendent of Indian Affairs, to find out exactly what the government wished the Navajos to do. The delegation was informed that if they do not comply with the terms of the Newby Treaty, Bear Springs, and give up all Mexican captives, all murderers of Mexicans who had found sanctuary among them, and all Mexican livestock, a body of troops would be sent to enforce their doing so. These 2 Navajos promised to send word to all the other chiefs to be in camp tomorrow at noon and have all these matters settled. The next day, August 31, 1849, Narbona and his men rode to the guard lines of the army camp, where the main body halted in Narbona, and his headmen were escorted to the tent of Colonel Washington. The Simpson report describes Narbona in these words. Another man who was quite old and a very large frame had a grave and contemplative countenance, not unlike, as many of the other officers remarked, that of General Washington. He wore a striped hand-woven blanket over his shoulders. To this group, Calhoun proceeded to explain the terms of the treaty, and Mr. Conklin, as interpreter, Lieutenant Sampson, gives us a detailed report of this conference held between the government officials and the three elderly Navajo chieftains, Narbona, Chief Jose Largo, and Archuleta. Mr. Calhoun tell them they are lawfully in the jurisdiction of the United States, and they must respect this jurisdiction. Interpreter. They said they understand it. Mr. Calhoun tell them after the treaty is made, their friends will be the friends of the United States, and their enemies, the enemies of the United States. Tell them when any difficulty occurs between them and any other nation, by appealing to the United States, they may get redress. Are they willing to be at peace with all of their friends of the United States? Interpreter. They say they are willing. Mr. Calhoun tell them that by the treaty, which is proposed to make them all trade between themselves and other nations, will be recognized as under regulations to be prescribed by the United States. Colonel Washington, and the object of this is to prevent their being imposed upon by bad men. Interpreter. They understand it and are content. Mr. Calhoun, tell them if any wrong is done by them, citizens of the United States, or by Mexicans, he or they shall be punished by the United States as if the wrong had been done by a citizen of the United States and on a citizen of the United States. Interpreter. They say they understand it and it is all right. Mr. Calhoun, the people of the United States shall go in and out of their country without molestation under such regulations as shall be prescribed by the United States. Interpreter. They say they will. Mr. Calhoun, tell them that by this treaty, the government of the United States are to be recognized as having the right to establish military posts in their country wherever they may think it necessary in order to assure the protection of them and their rights. That the government of the United States claim the right to have their boundaries fixed and marked so as to prevent any misunderstanding on this point between them and their neighbors. Interpreter. They say they are very glad, Mr. Calhoun, for and in consideration all of this and a faithful performance of the treaty, the government of the United States will from time to time make them present, such as axes, hoes, and other farming utensils, blankets, etc. Interpreter. They say it's all right. That all 9 points of the treaty had been explained to the chiefs and other headmen in attendance, and they had indicated their approval. Narbona and Jose Largo expressed their wish to be excused from attending the council at Deschamps, stating that they would send delegations to take their place. Papers were signed giving powers of attorney to Armijo and Pedro Jose, both of whom spoke enough Spanish to make themselves understood. These two younger chiefs now had authority to act for them at Deschamps Council in the same manner and to the same extent as if they were present. The council having ended, the group of Navajos walked back to their tribesmen and mounted their horses. It was a colorful spectacle. All wore red, yellow, and blue striped blankets, and some wore helmets topped by eagle feathers, while nearly all carried rifles erect to their right hands. Sandoval, the Navajo from Cibolito, was riding back and forth in front of this group, pointing out the error of their ways and warning them of the consequences they might incur when suddenly someone espied a Navajo on a horse that had belonged to a Mexican trooper and had been missing for a couple of days. Word was sent to Colonel Washington, who immediately demanded its return. The Navajo youth riding the horse declared it was his own and immediately disappeared down a side gully. Then the colonel ordered the Navajos to hand over one of their best horses to replace the one that had been stolen. But as the troopers came toward them, the Navajos became frightened and rode pell-mell down the slope in hasty retreat. The guards were ordered to fire a round of shots after them, and as there were more than 100 riflemen in the guard unit, the result was disastrous for the Navajos. They had halted at a little distance to collect their dead and wounded when the cannon sent its missiles among them, thus catching them off guard. Narbona had been one of the last to retreat, and being in direct line of fire, was mortally wounded. 16 or 17 Navajos were killed outright, and 7 others died later of wounds they had received. Narbona lived to reach his hogan and to say farewell to his family. He knew he was about to die, and his last words were, I am old, and it's time for me to go. So do not be sorrowful at my passing, but grieve for the women and children whose men will not return. No other leader has been so long remembered. Narbona's family prepared his body for burial. He was bathed and sprinkled with sacred corn pollen, then dressed in his finest buckskin garments with silver buttons and belt. Coral and silver beads and silver bracelets were included, and his feathered helmet was placed on his head. One of his long war bows and its quiver of arrows was placed by his side, and the body was wrapped together with these items in several layers of blankets, and then enclosed in a large buffalo pelt, which was turned with the fur on the inside. The whole roll was then bound with strand after strand of horsehair rope, tied in intervals into the death knot. Toward evening, 2 of his sons saddled and bridled his 2 favorite horses, the Palomino and the Gray Stallion, tied his body across the saddles, and proceeded slowly to Rock Mesa, where a deep crevice made a natural tomb, lowering the body into its final resting place. They covered it deeply with grass and small bush, on top of which they shoveled a thick layer of earth. Then they gathered rocks of every size and distributed them so as to completely hide the burial. When this was done, at sunset, they led the horses some distance to the north, as this was the direction his spirit would take on its journey to the land of spirits, since they did not wish to remain near the burial, because some enemy might locate and open the grave to obtain the wealth of jewelry it contained. They crossed the valley and stopped on a low hill. Here they killed the horses and then proceeded to chop the saddle and bridles into small bits so they could be of no possible use to anyone wandering that way. The axe and the shovel they had used were broken and hidden among the stones. As the darkness gathered, they found a sheltered spot where they could view Rock Mesa, found wood for a small fire, and prepared for a long vigil. 4 nights they remained chanting prayers throughout the hours of darkness and going only short distances for water or wood during the day. They ate no morsel of food during this time and spoke only with signs or shakes of the head. After the 4th night of prayers, they believed the chief spirit had traveled so far on the rainbow trail that their prayers could not reach him, and the next morning they started for home. When they reached the north bank of the Rio Tunicha, they built a sweat house near some rocks that had been recently piled in the spot and spent the day and night in and out of the sweat bath. The next morning they found the clean clothing their wives had left for them under the stones, and bearing all the clothes they had worn during the burial, they had went home to feast and sleep. The army continued its march over Washington Pass and down the mouth of Canyon de Chelly. Here the treaty was signed by 24 chieftains. If the governor and his military advisors believed the death of Narbona would cause the members of the tribe to submit to the terms of the treaty, they were greatly mistaken. In fact, the old chief was very likely the only one who might have held him to its terms. Now that he was gone, tribal affairs were in the hands of a hot-headed young man who, angered by the murder of their leader and the destruction of their farms and homes, were bent on revenge. They even followed the army across the mountain, capturing some of the pack mules and stampeding a number of horses. In 1851, a defense was established at Bonito Canyon called Hell Hollow by soldiers. Well inside Navajo territory, its avowed purpose was to subdue the Navajos or exterminate them. These conditions lasted until 1863, when the Navajo Nation was taken captive. and marched to the Bosque Redondo. And then the words of the blind prophet came true. The Navajo people no longer farmed the fertile valleys or grazed their sheep across the wide mesas. The hungry coyote and the black-winged crow no longer feasted on stray lambs or Navajo corn, and only the wind spirits talked to the lonely mountains. Okay, that's chapter 4 of Hosteen Klah. You can get this book on Amazon. Just Google Hosteen Klah, and it's titled Navajo Medicine Man and Sandpaper. Okay, so pretty good book, powerful book. Some really good information in there in this book. Okay, again, thank you, and I hope you have a good day.